10.49. From the very inception of the record to what we currently now know as modern track and field, you will see this number on virtually every professional level women's 100-meter showdown.
Produced a season's best.
The women's 100 meters final.
Côte d'Ivoire in 5. Fraser Price, Jamaica in 6.
It's a time that sent shockwaves across the world and is one of the few records from the 80s that still stand to this day, surviving the abundant talent that has swarmed the scene for the last 3.5 decades. But here's the thing. It's not legitimate, guys. Like, it's not even close. No, I don't want to hear about the swirling winds, the hair blowing in whatever direction, the crosswinds, or that she would have run this time anyways. There is no reason why this record should have ever been ratified, and the governing body of athletics simply needs to get rid of it. Some might be curious why I even care so much about this and why I opted to make a video about it in the first place. Well, the 100-meter record is arguably the crown jewel of women's records in athletics. It's the most popular event, it's one of the most competitive events, and therefore a world record of this prestige should be treated with the respect it deserves. And I've yet to see someone publicly assert that world athletics should reconsider this decision over 35 years later, even if most of the staff are entirely different people now. Other people might be saying, well, flo-jo's records were done with the help of PEDs anyways, blah blah blah. Look, I've done my fair share of research of PEDs in professional track and field, especially 1988 in particular. That's not what this video is about. This is a video highlighting from a technical standpoint of how a record was blatantly unrightfully ratified, and that the actual women's 100-meter world record belongs to Jamaica's Elaine Thompson-Herah, who ran 10:54 at the 2021 Pre-Classic. Before we get into further detail though, let's recount what happened that led to this whole debate in the first place. For those who aren't entirely familiar with this mark, USA's Florence Griffith-Joyner, or flo-jo, ran a time of 10:49 at the 1988 US Olympic trials in the quarterfinals. Even the moment this record occurred, people were confused that the wind gauge recorded a strangely precise 0.0 meters per second reading, meaning that there was apparently no wind present at all, especially since countless people reported the weather was notably windy that day, so much so that it would definitely exceed the legal limit of plus 2.0 meters per second. In other words, a decently strong tailwind. This spawned a myriad of controversial articles about this record, but at the end of it all, the IAAF did ratify it without much question, and it has yet to be beaten 36 years later. Over time, people just kind of accepted the record, and you'll see people even to this day defend the time as authentic, and dismiss people's concerns of it for being the crown jewel of sprinting records, which in my opinion is primarily due to their emotional attachment to either flo-jo herself, or the era they grew up in when this record happened. However, years after flo-jo's magnum opus, a man from the Department of Physics from the University of Western Australia published a paper in 1995 for the IAAF to dispute the ratification of flo-jo's record. It's not that lengthy, but it is very analytical down to each individual athlete of the race flo-jo was involved in, and goes into solid detail of the intricacies of wind gauges, other statistical anomalies, and more. So in order for a time in the 100-meter, 200-meter, long jump, and triple jump to be ratified as a record, you cannot have a tailwind or headwind exceeding 2 meters, mainly denoted as plus 2.0 for a tailwind and minus 2.0 for a headwind. On July 16, 1988, the US Olympic Trials wind readings for the women's 100-meter heats and quarterfinals were recorded as follows. All of the heats recorded a wind reading above plus 3.0, with heat 3 being slightly below that. The third quarterfinal also recorded a massive 5 meters per second tailwind, but then we look at the two prior quarterfinal rounds and what's going on here? It's just 0.0 on the dot. Flo-jo ran in quarterfinal 1, which is one of the two suspicious heats. Without even thinking, this chart alone obviously points out some very strange outliers that require some looking into, especially since the last quarterfinal round recorded a huge tailwind, and nearly every athlete throughout every quarterfinal ran a new season or even personal best, something you'll pretty much never see at this early of a stage in a 100-meter competition. I mean, some of these PBs are pretty egregious. To understand how we can speculate if there is actually anything going on though, one of the first ways we can do that is to look at the performances themselves and see if they follow a traditional curve athletes normally display when running through the various rounds of a championship event. Normally, when an athlete is trying to advance past the first couple rounds of a championship event in the 100, They're not just going to be sprinting all out in every race, or else they simply won't have enough energy or explosiveness for the semis and finals. Some will run pretty damn close to near max effort, but it's normally not 100%. The times themselves can appear different depending on the wind, but you can expect to see a curve resembling something like this. Every athlete will have slight variations in effort, but the paper does clarify this as such via biomechanical analysis and adjusts accordingly. With that said, let's take a look at Jennifer Anissa's performances, who made the finals, but qualified through quarterfinal 3. The paper notes that she's constantly running at near max effort across all heats, and the plotted points are close to the expected curve for a championship event when accounting for wind. Now let's take a look at the same scenario, but for someone who ran in quarterfinal 2, Alice Brown. Her quarterfinal mark doesn't even remotely match the normal curve, but now let's take a look at flo-jo, who ran in quarterfinal 1.
Huh?
Yeah, she's also way off the natural curve here as well. From these examples and more, the author attributes an estimate of about plus 5 to 7 meters per second wind, and when plotted, it fits the curve pretty well. There's a lot of other examples that you can pause for yourself to see, but it's clear as day that pretty much every performance here within these two heats are a complete anomaly and certainly lean towards the heats being very much wind aided. Now let's take a look at the triple jump. But wait, what does the triple jump have to do with any of this? Well, the men's triple jump happened to be occurring at the same time the women's 100-meter quarterfinals were, and more importantly, the event does run parallel to the home stretch of the track. Thus, both athletes are running in the exact same direction, and not that far apart from one another either. If we take a look at the wind recordings for every single athlete in the triple jump, there are only 3 out of the 46 measured jumps that record a wind reading of less than plus 2 meters per second. While it's entirely possible quarterfinals 1 and 2 could have been running during jumps where the wind was legal, this simply could not be the case. Right before quarterfinal 1 of the women's 100, Robert Cannon's jump at the time read a wind speed of plus 4.3 meters per second, and subsequent jumps were nowhere near wind legal either. That's really all there is to talk about this, but now let's take a look at the device itself that measures the wind. If you don't know how the wind gauge or anemometer works, it's pretty simple. Basically, you have these spinny boys that measure the speed and the direction of the wind. These are hooked up to an electronic system, and the way they get a value is by taking 10 samples of the wind over 10 seconds, averaging them out, and voila, you have your official wind reading. In order for a flat 0.0 wind result to occur though, there are apparently a few possibilities here. 1, there's just simply no wind, or 2, some have cited that swirling winds can cause this reading, which is wind that can have samples cancel out each other from the wind gauge. Or 3, that a crosswind occurred, aka that the wind was running perpendicular to the direction the athletes were sprinting. A spokesman from Swiss Timing, the people behind the very anemometer used for the Olympic trials, claimed that the wind reading for quarterfinal 1 was actually 2.8 meters per second at 91 degrees towards the direction of the athletes, meaning it was just about a straight up crosswind going from left to right. Lastly, and not many people mention this, but the wind wasn't just recorded at 0.0. We can see that it was somehow measured at 0.00 meters per second. That means they are claiming this crosswind was so precise that it produced no tailwind at all down to the very 100th of a second. So overall though, what on earth caused the wind gauge to produce a 0.00 then, if we don't think it's a legitimate reading? Well, the paper cites that the wind gauge might have been misaligned to the point where it effectively tricked the wind gauge algorithm to produce a 0 reading, and that for quarterfinal 3, they finally fixed this issue. It's also entirely possible that the wind gauge just wasn't recording properly at all, and that the issue relies on mechanical interference if anything. To come to a more likely conclusion, I decided to look into what can cause exact 0.00 readings from anemometers, and this is what I found. So the very concept of a wind anemometer spinning, but producing a value of 0.00, isn't foreign to just this particular instance. In fact, you can find a fair bit of hobby sailors expressing issues with their wind reading devices, where the cups would be spinning and recording, but still producing a value of no wind despite there very clearly being wind. To put it short, the most common error I found among all of these problems is that there was likely some sort of connection problem. It does appear to be reasonably fixable in anemometers, which is why after quarterfinals 1 and 2, Swiss Timing likely fixed their equipment and the wind speed started recording properly once again. And that goes for everything before and after these races. Some say that the anemometer may have been pointing in the wrong direction, but I find a connection issue much more plausible given what I've read anecdotally about anemometer malfunctions. I also decided to contact one of the biggest meteorologists on YouTube, Andy Hill, and wanted to see what they thought upon sending them the study and some of my findings. Regarding the possibility of the winds being perpendicular to the track, Andy states that the wind being exactly 0.00 would be practically impossible, especially since the wind reading wasn't a perfect 90 degrees towards the track, but rather 91 degrees. He also states that between the two heats, seeing readings that range from -1.5 to +1.5 meters per second would reflect perpendicular winds as opposed to two consecutive 0.00 ones, and that even if the readings were as small as +0.1 or -0.4, this would be far more believable and reflective of proper wind recording equipment overall. Other than that, the only major argument flo-jo defenders have is that the wind was swirling. If they were swirling, surely there would have been a few negative values here and there, or something close to the seemingly mythical 0.00 value too. I also couldn't find any promising literature on anemometers producing values like this in swirling winds, which overall makes me render this theory obscenely unlikely and comes across as something they just came up with to feed to the press. So let's summarize our findings. First, flo-jo's race performance trajectory for the US Olympic trials does not come even close to resembling a traditional athlete's progression curve at an international event, even if we account for the fact that she runs at near max effort in the early rounds. When the mark is amended among other athletes in the race, it fits the traditional race qualifiers curve quite well and resembles a much more logical time. Second, at the time of the quarterfinals, the triple jump did not record a single wind legal reading at any point in time. As again, Robert Cannon's jump recorded a +4.3 meters per second right before quarterfinal 1 took place. Quarterfinal 2 also recorded a value of 0.0, which makes it even more unlikely given quarterfinal 3 recorded a tailwind of +5 meters per second. There is also sufficient evidence to suggest that the winds were not swirling or were crosswinds when the athletes were running, because the triple jump that was right next to the home stretch of the track was producing consistently high tailwinds during the entirety of the event. Most documentation of people having problems with their anemometers that produce a 0.0 value seems to be centered around the notion of connection issues within the system, and given quarterfinal 3 started recording the suspected values of the two prior rounds, it's by far the most logically sound conclusion that the connection issues were apparent, despite what Swiss timing says about how they were recording the wind. Overall, I'm quite surprised after reading through this paper again and again, in contrast with the conflicting evidence, which isn't a lot mind you, that World Athletics never retroactively removed flo-jo's 1049 and replaced it with her 1061, which she without a shadow of a doubt did in wind legal conditions. Even if we can't prove exactly what the wind was at the time, I still don't understand how this record got ratified, because the wind reading of 0.00 is very obviously not accurate. So by that virtue alone, why did this mark get ratified if the equipment was at least not working in any capacity? Like, this is the 100-meter world record we're talking here. Things like this need to be held accountable because they will just live forever while athletes struggle to beat this time when it wasn't even achieved legitimately in the first place. Look, flo-jo was and is still a track and field icon, so for her to run 1049 was the ultimate mark that would be remembered for generations to come, and was also the best possible precedent to set going into the 1988 Olympics. However, despite acknowledging the cultural impact it had on the sport as a whole, the overwhelming amount of evidence suggests that this mark is simply illegitimate. But her 1061 still would have lasted as the world record for over 30 years before Elaine Thompson-Herah broke it. In my opinion, the balance of probabilities should be the model here to determine if the record was legitimate or not. Is there actually a greater than 50% chance that the win was legal that day? The current evidence unequivocally suggests not, so if someone could make up that deficit with conflicting data, then I'd love to hear it. So far though, this has not happened. As it currently stands, Elaine Thompson-Herah is simply the fastest woman to ever live by a sizable margin, and I encourage others to voice this as well. For those who love flo-jo, including me, this could be a tough pill to swallow for those who were around during such a phenomenal era of the sport. But I encourage those who are passionate about record keeping to mention World Athletics in some fashion. You can even send them an email of this study and your concerns, and to let them know that you care about the history books that remind us just how great this sport is. After all, a record this delicate and pristine should be treated as such. Again, I know some people are going to mention doping, but come on, let's not act like flo-jo would be the only person on the sauce if this were the case. That aside though, let me know what you guys think in the comments, because I'm sure longtime followers of the sport have a lot of interesting things to say that they've been saving up for a while. Thank you to all my patrons for supporting the channel, and if you want to support the channel for more content like this, come on over and become a patron, drop a sub, and check out my other links below. I'll see you all in whatever video I upload next, and take care.